Well, for some more insight into the massive task investigators are facing, we're joined by Bill Hinshaw at CNN Center in Atlanta. He's a former special agent with the FBI and a veteran of many bombing and hijacking investigations. And from New York, former City Police Commissioner Ray Kelly. Welcome to both of you. Bill, first to you. How do you get knives and box cutters on airplanes? In fact, on 4 different airplanes within about an hour and a half.
Well, I think it was pretty well planned, and it's relatively easy, or was relatively easy, because I think the focus of the interdiction was against weapons and explosives and not against knives or screwdrivers or box cutters.
But you know, Bill, you still got to get through security, and every time I go through security, I go through, my body goes through the metal detector and my carry-on baggage goes through the machine. Isn't anybody looking?
I've gotten on the plane with Swiss Army knives. I got on the last flight I was on was behind a guy that had a toolbox that had a number of fancy looking tools, but among them was a box cutter and several long screwdrivers. So I think the whole focus was not on what the hijackers used.
Ray, do you think the questions, have you packed your own bags and have your luggage been with you since you packed them? Are those questions simply of no value?
Yeah, I think they're of no value. I think they're silly. If you remember when we first started these magnetometers and checking people in, we used law enforcement personnel to do that. We've gotten away from that for a long time. We now use people who try hard, but certainly the standards are not very high. There's tremendous turnover. That's something that I believe has to change right now in the near term. It's just it's a silly exercise.
It was a pleasure.
Ray, what do you make of the fact that they were able to get knives and box cutters? I mean, it wasn't simply one slip, one person. I mean, this was a plan. 4 different flights had them.
Undoubtedly, it was a plan, and I'm sure it was practiced. It was something that they just didn't do for the first time. You know, if you look at the FAA tests that they do at virtually every major airport each year, some of the failure rates are as high as 80%. So it's an area that needs to be looked at and needs to be changed radically. It's drifted so much since the 70s when we first started these types of security checks.
You know, Bill, when I hear him say 80% failure, that apparently we've known there's an 80% failure in the security on these questions and getting weapons onto planes, I must admit I'm scandalized. I mean, is this what's been happening in our airports?
I suppose it has. That's what the tests show. But until we had an event such as this, it didn't really come to become a national event.
Ray, obviously the pilots of these planes have gone down, but there are a lot of people that may have helped these pilots commit this horrible crime. How do we find the others, the ones who may have helped a little bit and therefore are co-conspirators and just as responsible?
Well, you do the classic backtracking investigation, just what the FBI is doing now. You're checking rental car records, you're checking itinerary. I mean, we've seen it. We saw it in 1999 with Ahmad Rassam. We know that Canada is clearly an easy point of entry for people to come from places like the Middle East, get into Canada, and then come across our border. Last year, we had almost 500 million visitors into the United States. We need a much stronger border protection. We tried to get that in Congress after Ahmad Rassam came across in the millennium in 1999, and there was, quite frankly, no response. We need a much more robust examination of people coming into the United States. It hasn't changed, certainly in the last 2 years, and that was Rassam came in with 150 pounds of explosive and was headed for LAX. He was convicted. He also, by the way, pointed towards Osama bin Laden. So, I mean, more and more evidence is being accumulated that points to bin Laden as our major enemy in this area.
Bill, how easy to get into these cockpits?
Well, the last plane I was on, the cockpit door was open a good bit of the time. In the days a quarter of a century ago when we were facing the hijackings, or people were hijacking for money, they closed the cockpit door, and usually there was an armed sky marshal behind there, and nobody went in there, not even flight attendants. So,
but today, I mean, but obviously 4 did get in. Do you think it's extortion that they threaten the pilots? They're going to slit someone's throat or do something like that to get the pilots to open the doors?
I think they possibly could have, because my understanding is that the assumptions have always been, don't do anything to make the hijackers mad. Let's get them on the ground. We'll negotiate with them, give them pizzas for passengers, and do something like that. These people obviously had an entirely different intent, and they didn't fit the profile, and we paid for it.
Ray, I've heard so often everyone say these are trained pilots, experienced pilots, and I do understand there's some reports saying that they had trained in Florida. But to fly a 757 or a 767, at least I would think, takes a significant amount of training, does it not?
Well, you know, these aircraft these days are fly-by-wire. They're computer controlled. You can get even simulator programs for computers. I think once it's up in the air, it's probably not that challenging, particularly if you've had some flight training. So I think it's probably easier than you might suspect.
What about aiming, though? They still wanted to hit targets. 3 of the planes were headed for targets.
Right, and I think obviously they had some training in that regard. But I mean, you talk to pilots, they say that it isn't that complicated. There is a lot of this, of course, is on automatic pilot. You get from one location to the other by going from point to point. You disengage that automatic pilot, then you do the aiming. Yes, it takes some training, but I'm told it doesn't take that much to be able to steer the aircraft.
All right, Bill Henshaw, Ray Kelly, thank you very much for